Jon, I am so excited to welcome you to the sisterhood. I'm a big fan of yours.
Well, thank you. I am honored to be ushered into the sisterhood. One of my sort of bucket list goals, hanging it with a sisterhood. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, we're really, really glad to have you. And why don't you tell everyone where you live and kind of what stage in life you're in?
Okay. Yes. I grew up in Australia. I moved to the US in the late 1900s, and I have lived in New York for the last 16 years. I am a pastor and an author, and I've just hit the glorious empty nester years. Now, I say that super easy, but I did have to do a week of intense marriage therapy when the kids left, just to get a little tune up, take a deep dive, see what was happening under the hood. And we came out in pretty good shape, but we're really enjoying it now.
Okay, really so wait, are you serious? You went and did a week?
Yes.
You where?
100%.
I need to hear about this place.
Well, yeah, my son had been gone for a couple of years. My daughter went off to college, and I was like, you know what? We've been, pastoring through COVID was hard. We've got a lot of stuff going on. So we brought them to New York, and they did a morning with me, the afternoon with my wife, and then they brought us together and said, here's what you said about each other. Let's get into it. And so it was great. No real surprises. But it was, I came out of it just like more in love with my wife. That's the truth. I was like, gosh, I just married such a great woman, and feel very, 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 very grateful to be married this long and still have a heart of joy. But they brought that into contrast. They just dug up the stuff that got dormant that you'd been neglecting and said, so that, I left with a bunch of homework, stuff I had to do, and it was really good. But anyway, it's been really kind of like a sort of second honeymoon. I know everyone doesn't have that, but everyone said to us, if you don't work on this is going to hit you in the head, and you're going to be looking at each other, and all your energy is going to go into your kids. So I am very grateful to have sort of landed where we are. So
yeah,
it's disorienting. I mean, I'm like, I miss my kids. I do. I don't miss them, and then I miss them with like an ache in my stomach, and then it passes, and then I'm like, no, it's good to be alone again,
Yeah. So. I like that when I put something here, it's still there when I come back the next day.
Yes, no, totally. Where's that? Oh, I can't blame anybody else. I just lost that myself now. Yes.
Well, so tell us about your kids.
Well, I have a son named Nathan, and he is currently serving on the mission field with YWAM. So he's out and about sharing the gospel with people in the Muslim world somewhere. And I have just a wonderful daughter who we still call Sweet Baby Haley. And you'd never knew that she was raised in Manhattan. I mean, she's like from another time. And she is studying nursing in Tennessee. And so both very godly kids, got a pretty strong family culture, been through a lot of wild things together that pulled us close rather than driving us apart, which it could have. And they're making all the mistakes that young adults make with a measure of grace that's like pretty remarkable. So it's a joy to watch them. It's a joy to watch them do their thing,
It's great. Well, so you've raised a son, and you are in a season because of your book where you're talking a lot about boys and raising sons. And we are in this series. And so we were so excited to have you on to talk about this. And so give us a little bit, especially being in New York, you probably have your finger a little bit on the pulse of what's happening. What is happening with boys in today's culture? Give us kind of an overview of what it's like being a boy now and what it's like parenting boys.
Well, I just want to start by giving some props to all the moms who are listening, because I think parenting today is definitely harder than when I did it. My kids grew up. My son got his first phone when he was 11. That was primarily because we lived in New York, and I wanted to be able him to call me if he was taking the train to school. But the rise of technology, the amount of pornography that's available, the confusion around gender, it is a very, very hard time. It doesn't mean it's impossible, and there's a lot of upside to it, meaning the level of intentionality that will be required. Whereas before you might have just sort of winged it, hey, the youth group's pretty good, church is pretty good. We'll just sort of plug in. I think those days are over. So yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion. And right now, I'm sure you know this, there is a crisis in masculinity in the US. And I don't mean just in toxic masculinity. I don't mean in some of those cultural dynamics. Men are struggling with rates of depression more than ever before. Over 70% of all suicides in America are men who are committing suicide. It's just sort of like the world has been redesigned away from the traditional male gifts. And it's very, very confusing. The Washington Post just did an article on college-age guys who are absolutely stuck in deep malaise and just cannot find a way forward. So we need mums more than ever to be godly and to lean in and to speak encouragement and hope and call out the best in their sons, because they are definitely heading into a world that's very different than the one that we grew up in.
Yeah, that can feel really overwhelming, I think, for parents. And it can feel hopeless. So I appreciate that you said there is hope. And I hope that's what we can leave our listeners with today, with some tools and a little bit of encouragement of, no, we can do this. We can really help our sons. So you say that it's not enough to hope our sons will become good men, that you actually say we need them to be good at being men.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, it basically means this. If you let the culture raise your son, he's going to learn about sex from Pornhub. He's going to learn about how to navigate life through YouTube. He is going to deal with his aggression through video games, which means he's going to, for the most part, fail to make progress in real life. He's not going to accumulate the skills necessary to deal with things like relationships, money, work ethic, organization. So we probably need to be intentional. And so you know what it's like when you get a guy and he's a quote unquote great guy, but he's just kind of useless. Like he can't do anything. He can't remember to show up on time. He can't balance his checkbook. He's perpetually late. He's disorganized. At some point, you're going to lose respect for somebody in their 30s who hasn't mastered those basic level skills. And so I'm basically making the case that because the world is challenging and there's a lot of difficulties, we're going to have to work hard with a distinct vision to help our sons figure out how to do those things well. And I don't think there's many cultural mechanisms. You know, when I went to school, the education was so different than what's happening in schools right now. Like in my high school, they taught motor mechanics and woodwork and home economics. And I mean, maybe that's Australia. I don't know what education was like in the 80s and 90s in the US, but today it's pretty ethereal. It's pretty sociologically focused, not even traditionally education focused. And so it's very, very possible to head into adulthood without any of the practical skills you need to be able to thrive on your own, let alone build a family, love someone, partner with someone else in life. So I'm trying to advocate for that conscious, intentional raising of kids. We've got this happening in our church in some pretty beautiful ways. We've got dads getting together, families getting together, doing skill impartation. Here's how to open a savings account. Here's how to cook a meal. Like everyone should have like 3 meals. They can always say, no, I got this. I can cook this. Just giving those basic life skills. And I think that's a little bit of a lost art. And I think it's an advantage we can have in Christian homes to sort of have our kids prepared to move into life.
Yeah, being an adulting, as they say.
Yes, I mean, the literature on adulting itself, it's like we've got a crisis at human adulting. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's true. I mean, that's true for girls too. But
yes, I
would say, I live in a city that has a lot of young adult professionals. Mm-hmm. So people who are making a lot of money in their mid to late 20s, early 30s, single, living together, with lots of housemates. And they do struggle. I see them struggle with some of the most basic adulting skills. And our high school, I think in response to this, tried to put together before COVID a couple of years ago, an adulting class, every Friday. But it was about how to open a checking account, how to do. And I thought, okay, there are probably a lot of kids at the high school whose parents aren't teaching them these things. I happen to be married to someone who is very focused on the practical life skill training. So to his credit, we are teaching our kids those things. But when you say Christian family, so that aren't parents, let's say we have some women listening whose kids are grown and they want to help young men do and learn some of these things. How would you say they can in a way that's not overly weird?
Well, I think I'll say this, I think the least effective way to parent is through nagging. And so just saying like, why don't you get your act together? I think most people would get their act together if they could get their act together, but they haven't been given the practical tools. So I don't know if it's like getting a subscription to something like I use Masterclass. I've taken so many classes on Masterclass. Sometimes it's mentoring relationships. It can be kind of informal. It's like, hey, let's get together and, fill in the blank, or bring them along while you do these things. I think the most important thing is to say, hey, look, I just want you to know I'm just committed to you prospering and thriving in every area of your life. And I want to come along and just, give you help where you need it. I think there could be some power too, maybe even in parents asking for a little bit of forgiveness, saying, hey, you know what, I'm just having a realization right now that I might not have given you some of these skills. And is there any way I can make this up in a way that's meaningful to you? And I know there's times where both my mum and dad have said something like that to me, and it moved me deeply. It created a deep sense of openness in my heart to sort of want to learn and follow into those things. But I would say, don't beat yourself up and overcompensate. Like trying to rush in now and fix everything, I think that's probably a bit too intense. But just sort of like gracefully move into that space, do it with consistency, offer help in ways that I think it's received. And I think there's so much power in intentionality in our parenting. I think it comes because parenting is God's idea. I think it comes with a divine sort of anointing almost, where when you move towards your kids with a heart of love, it just carries a potency that opens the heart in a strange way. So move towards them in love,
Yeah, it's really good. I heard you say the term toxic masculinity just a little bit ago. I'm wondering if you can explain what that is, and also how that term is shaping how our sons are viewing themselves, even as they are growing up. Because even my college age sons, there's a lot of toxic masculinity talk going around when things are brought up. So can you explain that?
Well, I think toxic masculinity, I think part of what gender is, particularly when it interacts with the other gender, is that it releases and restrains the best and worst of the other gender. So you get 20 guys, college-age guys in a room, and then one woman walks in the room. That woman has the power to change the entire dynamic. Men will sit up or they'll move the pizza box. Like there's something in them that raises nobility and sort of pushes back immaturity. The same thing happens. You've got 20 women in a room and a man walks in. It will shift the dynamic. So toxic masculinity doesn't care or value the shifting of the dynamic. And it just basically takes the stereotypes and runs with them and sort of lionizes them. So you think sex, money, power. It's just like, it's using your power to exploiting others for personal gain with your power. It doesn't matter what area it is. When it comes to sexuality, it's not about other-centered care. It's about pleasure and many times dehumanizing the person for the experience. When it comes to money, it's just like the aggressive accumulation, the spirit of mammon, wanting more regardless of where they get it from, what costs other people. When that gets embedded in a power structure, which is what I think we see with Harvey Weinstein, he built an entire ecosystem that facilitated sex, money, and power in an unhealthy and unbridled way at the cost of women's dignity. Well, that's a very unhealthy thing. So basically, that's, I think, what we're talking about. Unbridled, manly, sort of like the flesh manifests through male personality and male bodies. And it does a tremendous amount of damage, leaves it in its wake. So history is in many ways defined by toxic masculinity, like bad leaders using sex, money, and power to build systems of, that they can thrive in. So there is a huge reaction to it in our culture, but there can be an overreaction too. And here's the danger. Masculinity is by default toxic, which is not true. You get a godly man who is using his strength for the sake of others, and you are going to be living in a good world, a good society. And in the book, I talk about the Proverbs 31 man. Everyone wants to talk about the Proverbs 31 woman. But the chapter starts with the Proverbs 31 man, and it's actually a mother giving advice to her son based on her observations of the failure of King Solomon at the end of his life. And she says, do not give your strength to women, your vigor to those who ruin kings. And she's basically saying men possess an inherent male energy, which if channeled in the right direction is capable of tremendous good. But if given to the wrong things, creates incredible harm. So there's a famous passage that we trot out in justice movements that says, speak up for those who have no voice, judge fairly. Well, that's all a mother giving advice to her son about how to use his strength for the good of others. And I think that is sort of redemptive masculinity, which is like channeling the strength that a man has, but using it through the filter of sacrificial love for the good of the world. And what I'm concerned about in our society today is its toxic masculinity and passive masculinity. And a passive man who does nothing for others is, I don't want to say it's as bad as toxic masculinity, but it is certainly a liability to our world. So how do you get that vision for sort of godly masculinity? And that's what I'm trying to hit in the book, which is obviously the person of Jesus, you know?
Yeah. I would say I see a lot of passive masculinity happening in maybe response to that. I mean, just you know, the world, I feel like our sons don't understand what a third way is. They just are saying, okay, the feminists are rising and I'm not supposed to do that. And I'm not supposed to do that. And they don't really know the way forward. So how do you wrap some structure around that? How do you wrap some ideas around that help them move into that third space?
Well, what I've tried to do, and a lot of it is basically from my own journey and then a lot of insights from pastoring. I basically said, how did other society, like we are a broken society when it comes to forming men. I mean, like all of our mechanisms have failed us when it comes to making good men. I would say the church has failed us for the most part. Education has failed us for the most part. The workplace in many ways has failed us. So then you start looking at you look A, for biblical wisdom, B, then you start looking at other times of history and you realize they had these mechanisms and pathways to raise men. And it seems like we've lost it. You know, I mean, boys, particularly when they start hitting those teenage years, their bodies start to change, their interests begin to change. And it's a very confusing season. It's like, I'm sure it's the same way for young women, though I've never been a young woman. But like, I'm sure it's just a confusing time. It feels like your body, someone took over your body. You just view everything differently. There's a confusion and a competitiveness and ambition and insecurity. And that's got to be channeled somewhere. And if it's not channeled, people will try and self-initiate. They'll try and figure out what to do with all these changes. And other societies basically created intentional pathways to navigate the complexities of these energies with a group of older mentors so that they could move into life as mature, healthy, functional adults. We're one of the only societies in history that has lost that path. And so I just basically researched what that path is, made up my own version of it, and then sort of took my son through it. And again, if I could sum it up in one word, it would be like, have a vision of intentionally helping navigate these complex years and these complex seasons. And I want to say this, like that, I get a lot of feedback on the book that it's like really intense, and it is, because parenting is intense. But I will say this, some of the things that shaped both my son and my daughter, but particularly my son, were not my big grand plans. They were small moments that, because we were together and having a conversation, because I was intentional, those are the things that marked him forever. So again, it's not always those big things that make the difference. Sometimes it's the words spoken in season. It's like they confess something to you and you don't judge them. You have empathy and you listen and you talk about it. Sometimes it's a breakup, first heartache, and then you don't dismiss it with trite sayings like, well, you're young, there's plenty. No, you enter into that emotionally. And So I think it's a million small things with great intentionality over the course of a childhood that create this thick web of belonging and acceptance and love that has space for failure and celebrates the rewards, but maintains that emotional connection through those years so that they can move into adulthood with like healthy relationships, and particularly a healthy relationship with their mums and their families.
Talk to us about what you found in that research and what some of the common elements were and how you really created, like, I'd love some even practical examples of how you kind of took those concepts and then created something out of that.
Okay, so almost all societies, this is from a researcher named Michael Easter, who wrote an amazing book called The Comfort Crisis, and then a Jungian psychologist who named James Hollis, who does like sort of specializes in half life reflection, the midlife crisis. And because I'm in my middle years, I read 6 of his books this summer. So just
bring them on.
I'm always working on having like a theologically and culturally informed response to whatever crisis I'm going through. So anyway, they basically said that all societies had a 6-step process for raising men. And for raising boys into men. Here's what it was. Number 1, separation of the environment of childhood, which means they stopped letting kids just hang around with kids, and they consciously put them into an environment with older men to be formed. Number 2, death of childhood psychology. They had some moment of initiation to sever their sense of childhood identity and to usher them into the gauntlet of formation. So in other societies, this is like circumcision would happen at age 13. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is like a physical mark. And obviously, society is different today, but we're still trying to come up with ways to basically shatter the childhood psychology. Paul said, when I was a child, I thought like a child. But now that I'm a man, I'm putting away that. So it's that conscious severing and process of doing that. Number 3, they would go into a process of formation where they would learn 3 things from the older men. Number 1, the story of their community. So they had a sense of rootedness and belonging. Number 2, the religion of their community to understand who their gods were. And then number 3, the skills needed to function in a healthy way for the good of their community. 4th thing that would happen, they were sent out on what was called the ordeal. And the ordeal was that traditional masculine moment where they had to test and see whether the things that they put inside of them actually worked in real life on their own. So in Australia, for example, young Aboriginal men were sent to go walkabout for up to 6 months. Now, everything in Australia is trying to kill you. There's a spider, it's trying to kill you. There's a bird, it's probably trying to kill you. And so the thought of being left exposed for 6 months. I mean, the Maasai warriors had to kill a lion. Some of the Inuit tribes, they had to kill sea lions. I mean, these were like challenges that required that everything they would learn, primarily around courage and skill acquisition, was put into practice. Then stage 5, they were welcomed back by the community of men and they were recognized. And so they said, we affirm that you have matured to the point where you've overcome your childhood tendencies and you're now welcome. And then the 6th step was a celebration and integration back into society to serve society as a whole. And so you look at those 6 conscious steps and you ask, where does that exist in our world today? Well, you have, almost nowhere. You have very loose ones like middle school to high school. Maybe you get a good coach on a sports team. Very few communities on earth still shape people through this thing. So I just said, you know what? I'm going to recreate this for my son. I'm just going to make it up. And here's the thing. He's not going to know. If I do this with confidence, he's just going to think this is the thing that happens to everybody. So I just basically designed this. I did an initiation thing. My wife did a severing dinner with him, which is really intense. And then I basically came up with this curriculum to form him from a boy into a man that was a combination of character and skill and like amazing experiences to sort of bring these things to life. And then sent him on a gap year for his own version of the ordeal, sent him around the world to have his heart irreparably broken for the global poor so he wouldn't be a spoiled American kid. And then to finish it off, we did a 500-mile hike across Spain on the Camino de Santiago.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, to debrief everything that happened and sort of, and then at the very end of it, it opened our initiation ceremony started off the coast of New York, running into the ocean when he was 13. And it ended when he was 19, running off the coast of Spain at the end of the Camino, where pilgrims traditionally left behind something they carried across Spain. And he was leaving behind his childhood. And so this beautiful moment, this blessing ceremony, all these men wrote these letters of affirmation. And it's my son running out of the ocean towards me. And I just boomed out. I tried to do like the Father over Jesus. Who is this man that emerges from the ocean? This is my son. Total tearjerker, I'm telling you. It was wild. So yeah, I basically tried to reclaim that. I basically tried to take that pathway and then build that out for my son. I did something different for my daughter. I did a thing I called 50 Pieces of My Heart, which is like, here's the 50 things I want to make sure are in your life from my heart to yours. And that was less barbaric. I mean, for my daughter and I, like, we went to Iceland and looked at waterfalls. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, it's just that trying to intentionally give him a pathway and a sense of identity and blessing and help him navigate, sexuality, getting his first job, learning to drive, managing money, how to date properly. I try to basically build a little school of manhood for him and take him through it. So that's primarily what the book is about. It's like my journey and then how to build one for your own son. So
well, and I would imagine
what it was. Yeah.
Oh, it's so incredible. And it's so intentional. And it's just powerful to even listen to you talk about it. And I'm thinking probably while he's going through it, he doesn't feel like he's running through a gauntlet of steps. He just feels like this is what we're doing, right? Like you kind of created it more fluidly throughout. I mean, there's some things like the Camino, we're going on the Camino, but probably a lot of those small things, they just were a part of integrating them into your daily life.
It's true. I mean, the book is called The Intentional Father. Like, I believe that is the solution. It's intentionality. It's not called the perfect dad. You'll never be a perfect mom, but you can be an intentional mom. It's about consciously moving towards, with holy intent, loving intent towards your kids and giving them your best. And I think there's so much power in that. And I guess, yeah, I think my son, it felt very, very normal for him. It felt very intense. I mean, like he felt like, hey, my friends aren't doing this. But I tell you, one of the most beautiful moments I've had before my son, between semesters of school, he was back in New York for the summer, and we're driving along the road, and a song came on the radio that we used to both listen to when he was, when we were going through this. And he just said this statement to me. He said, Dad, you know what? At school, there was a lot of kids talking about their father wounds and what makes a good childhood, And he said, and I was like, oh gosh, here we go. He's like digging stuff up. I was literally bracing myself. And he said, what I realized when you grow up is that there's all these things that are meant to happen. And there's all these memories that you're meant to have. And I just want to say thank you because I have every one of them because of your intentionality.
Wow.
And I just was like weeping while I'm driving. And I was like, gosh, that's it. He didn't sound perfect. I mean, I've repented in front of my kids so much. It's like they make jokes about my repentance. You know what I mean? But it was just like, gosh, he looks back through his years and he said, yeah. And then I said, well, what are some of those things that stood out to you? And again, some were big things, some were big moments, planned moments. Some were tiny things. But again, some of them were just like little things that didn't take a bunch. Like one that he just loved is like one day I pretended to take him to school. And then I was like, called him from the office and said, got a family emergency. And we just went and watched Star Wars. And he's like, that just was so big for me. He said, and I never knew this. He said, you have no idea how hard a time I was having at school then with my friends. And I felt left out. And being able to go back to school and say, my dad took me to a movie made me feel so special in front of them. Like, I didn't know that. I didn't know what he was struggling with. Stuff like that. It's intense, small things with great love, as Mother Teresa said, that mark your kid's heart. And I will say this, these years, I mean, our childhoods, all the psychologists tell us, I mean, you're basically spending the rest of your life trying to deal with the blessings and brokenness of your childhood. Our capacity to mark their hearts for a lifetime is so high. That's why I'm so hopeful for mothers. It's because like you look at Susanna Wesley, and I'm sure at some point you've talked about her, but Susanna Wesley had a ton of kids. Most of them, or a lot of them, died. She had a terrible husband. Her life was a disaster, and yet she raised John and Charles Wesley in the middle of it. And it was her intentionality. She took each of her kids, she had 9 kids, I think, took them aside one-on-one and shared the gospel with them, tended to their hearts when she could. And look at the fruit from that. And you know the story, she would put the apron over her head to get time with God because she couldn't get space anywhere. And I've always loved that because so often mums feel so overwhelmed, work, home, kids, school, support. You know, you can see a mom just like, maybe in the modern version, it's like she locked herself in the food pantry, just like, when I'm in here, leave me alone. But the potency of a mother to intentionally shape a kid's heart at these formative stages, I mean, you can change the world with intentionality. So I can't wait to hear stories, and there's probably thousands already from your community, but hopefully this adds a little more fuel to it.
But I appreciate that you're speaking to the influence of a mom, because I think for our listeners, they can't control necessarily the men in their lives speaking into their sons' lives, but they can control their own actions.
Yes.
But I do have a question for you, as maybe this is more of a pastoral question than a dad question. But for women who either the dad is completely gone or he's emotionally absent and really isn't interested in kind of this intentional approach, what would you say? Because I do feel, and I'm hearing from you, that men speaking into boys is an important element in their development into a healthy sense of what it means to be a man. How can a mom influence inviting men into her son's life if dad is not on board or is just completely gone?
Well, that's something that I've dealt with a lot as a pastor. And I've definitely had people reach out in response to what I've written on that. The minority of families in America now are traditional, stable families, like we would think. 2 mom, you know, like mom, dad, biological mom and dad and kids. So people are coming at it from tons of different approaches. And I've had several moms reach out to me, you know, with tears on the keyboard, just writing an appeal saying, hey, I would give anything to have my husband back, or, but they're dealing with trauma. So I want to acknowledge it as a very, very painful, very, very real thing. There's a couple of books out there that I came across, not even necessarily ones that I would recommend because of the worldview that's behind them. But so I'll tell you the principle of how they dealt with it. I think you'll be able to pick it up. You'll see it. It's quite obvious. But these were moms who just basically said, I'm going to build a council of dads. I'm just going to build a council of dad. Dad's not around. I'm going to lean in and I'm just going to grab some guys together and I'm just going to ask, will you play this role in my son's life? I always advocate a father is essential, but a father is not enough. You need a community of men to come around and to really speak in and to get this done. So I advocate for this happening in cohorts, like dad's doing with his son, but there's a crew of other people. So there's mums who have basically gone out and built a council of dads. They've gone and said, let me find some strong mentors from around the place. Sometimes it's a coach. Sometimes it's ongoing relationships like formal mentoring. And sometimes it's one-off events. Would you help my son with this particular thing? So it's like she looked around at men who were good at particular things and say, would you teach my son how to do this one thing? And built that out. So I think there's, and by the way, being a part of a faith community, I don't know how people live in the modern world without faith and without a faith community. I mean, the world's falling apart. COVID's shown us how isolated we are. But if you're a part of a faith community, all you need to do is show up on Sunday and you're going to be in a room full of somewhat godly men, competent men, and men who at least have a vision for God, or they wouldn't be there. And I would gather them around and say, hey, well, you played this role in my son's life. And I can tell you, lots of people are busier than I am, but I am a busy man with a lot of responsibilities. But if a mum took me aside and said, dad's not around or dad's not on board, and I can see, would you teach my son how to speak publicly? 100% I would clear my schedule and do that. There's something in my heart that wants to do that. And the power of a mother to ask on behalf of her son, that's almost an irresistible force. So I think, perhaps it might take the mum. Mum might be dealing with a little bit of shame. I don't know. I would just say, get the shame out of your head. Don't receive that. Don't walk in that. There's going to be men who consider this an honor and are probably waiting to be asked. Maybe you're a little, you like boldness. You're like, well, I don't even know where to start. I would just start with one person and just see how that goes. And you don't have to come up with 6 or 10 years of solutions. You just got one problem in front of you, solve it with one person in front of you. And then I would just take it bit by bit. But hopefully churches begin to normalize this sort of thing. We've just implemented some mentoring stuff at our church and it's just gone wild. There's just such a hunger for younger folks to have mentors around. So, and if there's dads listening to this or whatever, and there's mums that are in a situation where they need your help, step up, volunteer, say, hey, would you be willing? Hey, or just include them in. I did this with Nate. There was other guys way more competent than me in certain areas. And I said, yeah, can Nate just draft in with what you're doing? And you sort of fill those gaps that I don't have there. So it takes a community. The church is a body, it's a family, and we need to rely on one another. If someone's not a part of a church, or you see a need around you, this is a beautiful way to bear witness to Jesus and the community of faith by inviting them in, those who are struggling. So huge need. Hopefully that's like 1 or 2 next steps.
What would you say to a dad who feels like, oh, I didn't start this at 13 and now my sons are a little bit older, or a mom? And also, what would you say to the parent whose child is just not really on board to be doing some of this? They're kind of that apathetic teen, and it's hard to get them to do things.
Well, I mean, I think that's just called teenagers in general, apathetic, not hugely motivated and unwilling. So, I mean, look, so how do you motivate a teenager? Well, that's a whole separate podcast here. I mean, like everything else, man, carrot and stick. Like literally motivate them with rewards and show them the consequences of missing out on these things. Like, again, nagging doesn't work. Building the emotional bond is very important. The kind of relationship you have in advance to get them to even want to do this in your teenage years, that's a whole nother episode about, what happened with our kids in our family culture when they were little. But I would just say, just be faithful. I promise you, your teenagers will very rarely give you the feedback that you're hoping. If you're waiting for affirmation from a teenager, you're going to be waiting until they're 40 and they go through their own crisis and have kids. That's just not a part of the season. It's just not what they do. But I will say this, just because they're not showing you gratitude, I promise you they are grateful in ways that you do not know. My daughter would say, I was pretty hard on my daughter. Hard, what I say, I had tight boundaries on my daughter because she was raised in Manhattan. Okay, so what she sees walking down the street was like different than other places. And sometimes her friends didn't have parents who were as disciplined or as concerned as I was. And there was times when she would fight with me, like, why do I have to be home so early? And, but she came to me later and she said, like, I secretly always loved that because it showed me that you cared. And I think that when you rarely sow and reap in the same season, and most of our parenting is sowing and not reaping, and it takes a long time for that fruit to come up. And like what the Bible says, do not become weary in doing good. At the proper time you reap a harvest if you don't give up. Stay the course. Parenting kids is rarely glorious and affirmative, which means we should encourage one another as parents. So I think that's the first thing I'd say. And what was the second thing again?
Okay. So first of all, I just need to say, we need to repeat that, sow and reap in the same season. Okay. Just letting us pause on that right there.
Yes.
My second question was, what if a parent just feels like this is really hard?
Late.
Yeah, it's too late.
Yeah.
My child's a teenager and I can't even motivate him to vacuum.
It's never too late. You know, when I'm 45, and when I was 20, I moved to America. Okay, so when I look back, and this is just kind of like how I'm wired, but I did during COVID an emotional map of my life, and what I mean by that is like, just like, what's the stuff that stayed with me, that struck me, and the greatest pain in my life that I carry is not having involvement from my parents in my college years in America around major decisions that I made. I was just would have ached for, and back then it was $1 a minute to talk to your parents. And I was making $5 an hour on campus, and it was like, so, I mean, literally think about how much it cost to talk to Australia. I mean, it's like, we don't have the tech we had back then. So the pain in my heart where I'm like, gosh, and this is why I try and stay so involved in my kids' lives. I'm by no means a helicopter hovering parent. My kids would say, we want more, not less. But in my college years, I needed advice. I needed mentoring. Fell in love with my wife. I needed someone to talk to about getting married. There's just nobody there. And so I just say, they need help navigating these areas. Now, if you jump in and like, well, if you do if you just start prescribing, it's the old Stephen Covey thing, and it's worth repeating. There's a story about a dad who says he's got a completely disengaged teenager. And he comes to Stephen Covey, who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and says, I don't understand my son. He won't listen to me. And he said, say that again. He says, I don't understand my son. He won't listen to me. He said, say that again. Don't understand my son. He won't listen to me. And he said, well, it seems to me that if you want to understand somebody, you have to listen to them. And it's just a classic prescribing into our kids' lives. That's not it. So I would just ask questions, get good at asking questions, draw their hearts out. Every conversation, I hope my kids don't listen to this, but every conversation I have with my kids, I'm consciously thinking, what's a question that gives me access to their heart? Like I'm thinking all the time, so my son's overseas right now. And I'm like, where are you experiencing stress? Or in what ways do you think I could have better prepared you for an overseas environment? I'm just trying to ask good questions, trying to open their hearts. So I would tell parents, don't expect rewards. That's the immediate rewards or affirmation. That's the first. If you get it, it's a gift. But secondarily, it's never too late. And I promise you that they're aching for wisdom more than you know. Again, don't overreact, which is like, I got to make up now. Ease your way in there. Consistency versus intensity is the key to parenting for me. So just be consistent in those small things. It will have a huge impact. And then do fun stuff and invite them into it. That's the beauty when they're a little older. Do great trips together. Do crazy stuff you couldn't do when you were a kid. Invite them into like some of the joys of adult pleasure that they can have access to, and just start rebuilding from there. The goal is to convert childhood authority into adult friendship. But you can start with adult friendship. You can start there and you can build something beautiful. So never too late.
That's such a good word. I do want to ask you, you talked about the college years. I think there is a struggle, especially in the late high school, college arena, where parents feel like, okay, I need to let go. I need to, it's time. I need to let go and I need to allow them to make their own decisions. And parents really pull back. What are some of your thoughts in regards to sons and the decisions they're making and what you just said? What's the balance there?
Well, one of the things, I mean, everyone's got a different philosophy, but if I'm paying the bills, we're going to be talking about the experience that you're having. You know what I mean? You get that beauty of that checkbook. It's liminal space. The college years are in between years. So you're trying to transition, you start moving out of all of like the skill sorts of things in particular. And then you start moving into the big 3 questions of life, which is basically character. Character is destiny. It's about vocation. It's about romantic relationships. And it's sort of like, how are you viewing sex and dating? What are you thinking about your future? And who are you becoming with the freedom that you have? And you sort of change the topic of conversation, but hopefully you keep it, you keep those things going. To completely pull back is to say, okay, then I will now entrust the American college industrial complex to take it from here. And I'm sorry, I do not trust the American industrial complex to take it from here. It's as simple as that. So you've got to figure out the right mechanisms. You've got to give them space to fail, you know. If you think that in college they're not going to break your heart, you know, well, you got another thing coming. I mean, they're gonna do the things that they do. But hopefully you've got enough of a relationship to navigate through it. And so if they see you as a source of wisdom and love, I think they'll ask, hey, how do you handle this situation?
Mm-hmm.
And then I always, you know, my conversation with my kids is always in 3 topics. What are you learning about yourself? What are you learning about life? What are you learning about God? And there's plenty to go from there. So what are you learning about God while you're at college? What are you learning about yourself while you're at college? What are you learning about how life works at college? And, you know, often it's a fresh chance to figure out ways to equip and help them with some of the things maybe you missed in high school. Hey, Dad, I'm not as organized as I need to be. Like, I feel like we missed that. Great, man. Let me do some research and help you on that. You know, it's another opportunity for an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, that is so helpful. So helpful. I have to ask this last question, and that is, there is, as we know, an epidemic of pornography, and just the way that boys are being, girls too, but since we're talking about sons, let's just focus on sons. They are being inundated with messages, and it is really cutting them at the knees in so many ways in their lives. Can you just speak to how parents can navigate that a little better with their sons?
Well, I tell you this, your son has probably seen porn already. I think that the first exposure is between ages 8 and 10. And it's just getting younger and younger. And porn today is not like a topless girl in Playboy. It is like hardcore, violent, misogynistic pornography. And I do not think in today's world it is possible to 100% create a world where your kids do not view porn in some way, shape, or form. And so what I mean by that, I mean, you should try, but what I mean by that is, like, you got to have the conversation teed up in advance. So you've got to have a theology of sexuality that is more compelling than the attraction of pornography. Like, so you got to have a good view of sex, God's view of it. You know, the typical Christian views are like, sex is so terrible, you don't want to do it until you meet someone that you love, and then you do it with them for the rest of your life alone. You know, like, all of our messaging is so off. And it's honest conversations. It's a good theology of sexuality. It is not thinking they wouldn't be interested or they won't look at it. Their friends. My son, I remember in high school, said he was the only kid that had a porn filter on his phone. His friends were making fun of him. So, you know, in our family, it's like all technology comes with gateways, like almost like social contracts. And so, you know, before my kids got their cell phones, they had to, like, I made my son in particular, like, listen to 2 podcasts on by former porn addicts, and then talked about technology, talked about how the brain is rewired through pornography, talk about what it's going to be like to talk to his future wife about how much porn he's viewed, and just like it's as honest as we can have it. And then, you know, to this day, I still get my son's Covenant Eyes reports every week voluntarily. Like, he's almost 22 and he's like, Dad, I want you to be my accountability partner because I trust that you understand my heart on it.
Wow.
And like, at some point, this is going to have to transition off, but like right now it's working well. So you've got to be wise. It starts younger than you think. And I'll say this, how you respond when your kid looks at porn is going to determine if he's going to hide in shame or bring it into the light for the rest of his life. And I know there can be a sense of like shock or betrayal, or it's like, it's a weird thing as a parent to think, you know, to like search through your kids' search thing and be like, oh my gosh, have they seen this? That can be like a very, very disorienting and painful moment as a parent. But we serve a God and who saves us by his grace, not by our performance. And if you help your kids understand, you know what, God will forgive you for this. God's got something better for this. I don't want you to have shame, ungodly shame about this. Let's bring this into the light. Humanizing the struggle, but not minimizing the impact. And if you get that right, my whole goal in my parenting for both of my kids was like, I want my kids to bring their sin to me so I can help them work through it, not hide it from me in shame. And to this day, both my kids will confess their sins to me voluntarily, but they'll say it like, can you please help me with this? I'm struggling so badly with this right now. And then they know Dad's here to help. Dad's not here to judge, condemn, moralize, lecture. Dad is here to help us. It's so hard. It is such a potent and a real issue. And we need pray for your kids, man. Pray for your kids. Put filters on things, and understand that your kids' friends know how to get past every filter you've installed.
Yeah.
Trust me. They've found ways through it. So that's why you need to have 2 filters, not 1 filter.
Well, if people want to hear more of you and about you and what you're talking about and doing, where can they find you?
I don't have like a website or anything, but I'm on Instagram with a pretty active account where you get a combination of theology, parenting, life in New York City, and the books I'm reading. That's just Jon Tyson, JONTY. So same on Twitter. If you want to listen in on our preaching, I preach the majority of the time in our church in New York City, and I'm regularly talking about secularism, how to follow Jesus in the midst of like a very hard culture. So yeah, that's our website. There is church.nyc, and it's got all the stuff. And I have a wonderful teaching team too. So
is that on the podcast?
Yeah, that's
as well.
Yeah, it sure is. You just type in Church of the City, New York, and that will show up. But
okay,
just trying to keep it real. Let me just say to all of you listeners, stay the course. Mums, sisterhood, stay the course. You are doing more than you know. It is having a bigger impact than you can see. Do not lose heart. Be faithful. God will use your intentionality and your faithfulness in ways you don't even see coming now. So do not give up.
Well, thank you, Jon, so much for all that you're doing. This message is so needed, and especially with our boys. And I'm going to be giving this to so many people as gifts, your book.
Well, I appreciate that. And thanks for what you guys are doing too. I love it.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Bye, Jon.
Bye.
All right. See you later.